1942. The Japanese soldier who expected death but found humanity. In the suffocating heat of the Pacific, the Japanese soldier takes his first step into an American POW camp. His eyes are filled with fear because everything he had been taught told him this would be his final moment. For years, the Imperial Japanese Army had drilled one message into its soldiers: if you fall into enemy hands, you will be tortured, you will be torn apart, you will lose your honor. So choose death over capture. And now this soldier had fallen into American hands. But something unexpected happened. No one touched him. If this story surprises you, you need to watch this video until the end, because what I'm about to tell you is one of the least known yet most striking truths of World War II. This is the story of how Western forces, particularly the American and British armies, treated even their most ruthless enemies with humanity. And this story is proof that even in the darkness of war, humanity can shine through. Are you ready? Then let's begin. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe and like. World War II was the bloodiest, most devastating conflict in human history. Millions lost their lives, cities were reduced to rubble, families were torn apart, and one of the fiercest theaters of this war was the Pacific. Here, American and British forces were locked in a deadly struggle against the Imperial Japanese Army. Blood was spilled for every island, for every inch of ground. From Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, from Burma to Singapore, the most brutal face of war revealed itself. The Japanese army was one of the most fanatical, most determined forces in military history. For these soldiers bound by the Bushido Code, surrender was worse than death. It meant dishonor. It meant bringing shame upon your family. It meant betraying the emperor. That's why Japanese soldiers fought to their last breath. They launched suicide attacks. Kamikaze pilots dove into ships. Banzai charges rushed American positions. They chose to end their own lives rather than surrender. But what if they were captured? This was the greatest nightmare in every Japanese soldier's mind, because the stories they were told were horrifying. Japanese propaganda depicted American and British soldiers as monsters. If you fall into their hands, they were told, they will torture you to death, they will cut off your limbs, they will cage you like an animal. This propaganda was so effective that many Japanese soldiers carried cyanide pills. They would choose death over capture. So what was the reality? The reality was nothing like what Japanese soldiers could have imagined. And to understand this truth, we first need to look at how Western forces approached warfare. The United States and Great Britain were the nations that laid the foundations of modern laws of war. The 1929 Geneva Convention clearly established how prisoners of war were to be treated. POWs would not be tortured. They would be provided with adequate food and shelter. They would receive medical care. Their human dignity would be preserved. And the American and British armies strive to uphold these principles even under the most difficult conditions. This wasn't just a rule on paper, it was a value embedded in the DNA of Western soldiers. Yes, the American soldier was trained to defeat the enemy, but he was also trained to treat a surrendering enemy with respect. The British soldier had fought across the empire, but he never engaged in behavior that would compromise his honor. For these soldiers, war wasn't barbarism, it was a duty. And when the duty was done, the enemy was no longer an enemy, but a human being. Now think about this. The Japanese soldier had been made to believe for years that Americans and British were barbarians. He was told that capture meant horrific torture. And then, when he was captured, what did he see? He saw an American soldier offering him water. He saw a British doctor dressing his wounds. He saw people feeding him, placing him in a safe tent. No one struck him. No one humiliated him. No one did the monstrous things portrayed in the propaganda films. For many Japanese soldiers, this was nothing short of a shock. Everything that had been drilled into their minds for years was crumbling in an instant. So where did this treatment come from? The answer lies in the fundamental values of American and British societies. These two nations had championed individual rights, human dignity, and the rule of law for centuries. The American Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal. The British legal tradition was founded on justice and fairness. These values weren't abandoned on the battlefield. American generals ordered their soldiers to treat prisoners well. British commanders mandated compliance with international law. Because they knew that winning a war wasn't enough, you had to win it with your honor intact. And this is where one of history's most ironic contradictions emerges. Because the Japanese army treated American and British prisoners in their custody very differently. Have you heard of the Bataan Death March? In 1942, in the Philippines, tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers who surrendered were forced to march over 60 miles by Japanese forces, in the heat, without water, starving. Those who fell were bayoneted. Those who tried to drink water were shot. Thousands of soldiers died during this march. Have you heard of the Burma Death Railway? British, Australian, and other Allied prisoners were forced to build a railway under inhuman conditions. Tens of thousands died from starvation, disease, and torture. Changi Prison, the Sandakan Camp, the Hell Ships, each one a separate tragedy, each one a crime against humanity. But now ask yourself, American and British soldiers could have taken revenge. They could have done the same to Japanese prisoners, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But they didn't. Why? Because for them, the war had a purpose. That purpose was to build a better world, freedom against tyranny, civilization against barbarism, humanity against hatred. If you commit the same atrocities as your enemy, what makes you any different? The American and British armies asked themselves this question and answered it through their actions. This was a nobility rarely seen in the history of warfare, and this nobility left deep marks on the minds of Japanese prisoners. They discovered that the people they had seen as enemies for years were actually honorable, compassionate human beings. They realized the propaganda was lies, and for many, this awareness changed the rest of their lives. Now put yourself in that Japanese soldier's place for a moment. You're expecting death, you're preparing for torture, and the man who approaches you gives you water, bandages your wounds, treats you like a human being. That moment shatters your entire worldview. And throughout this video, I'll be telling the stories of exactly these moments. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. In Part 2, we'll examine specific events that took place in American and British POW camps. We'll see the initial shock of Japanese soldiers, the details of camp life, and how this experience transformed them. These stories, compiled from eyewitness accounts, archival documents, and historians' research, will show how humanity can shine even in war's darkest hours. American soldiers fought in the hell of the Pacific. British soldiers sweated in the jungles of Burma, but none of them lost their honor, even after victory. This was true heroism, a victory won not with weapons, but with character. And this story is just beginning. If history moves you this much, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because every week we share the least known but most striking stories of World War II right here. Now let's move on to Part 2 and dive deeper into this story. The reality behind the propaganda. Welcome back to Part 2. We're continuing without slowing down. In Part 1, we described the initial shock Japanese soldiers experienced when they entered American and British POW camps. We saw how propaganda that had been drilled into their minds for years collapsed in an instant, Now we're going deeper into this story. Real events, real testimonies, real transformations. If you're ready, let's continue. 1944, Saipan Island. American Marines had been fighting for weeks to capture the island. Japanese forces resisted to their last breath. Banzai charges, suicide attacks, snipers hidden in caves. Every inch of ground was won at the cost of blood. And finally, the island fell. But with the end of the fighting came a new problem. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers had been taken prisoner, and these soldiers were expecting death. Let me share one testimony. Japanese Sergeant Yamamoto Kenji described what happened after he surrendered. "I put my hands behind my head and knelt down. I closed my eyes. I was waiting for the bullet from behind. Seconds passed. Nothing happened. When I opened my eyes, an American soldier was standing in front of me with a canteen in his hand. He was offering me water. At that moment, I cried for the first time in my life." This scene repeated itself countless times on Saipan. Japanese soldiers saw surrender as equivalent to death, but the treatment they received shattered all their expectations. American soldiers, despite being exhausted and angry, approached the prisoners professionally. Weapons were collected, wounds were dressed, water and food were distributed, and most importantly, no one was subjected to physical violence. How was this possible? American soldiers were human after all. They had lost friends, they had fallen into Japanese traps, they had witnessed kamikaze attacks, they had thousands of reasons to hate, yet they still maintained control. The answer lay in the American military's training system. Soldiers learned not just how to fight, but the laws of war. The articles of the Geneva Convention were memorized, the rules for treating prisoners were clearly stated, and it was emphasized that there were serious consequences for not following these rules. But more importantly, the American soldier was raised with a value system that cherished justice, mercy, and human dignity. This system served as a guide even in war's darkest moments. The same was true for the British Army. British soldiers fighting on the Burma front were dealing with some of the world's harshest conditions: tropical diseases, intense jungle warfare, inadequate supply lines, and facing them, a fanatical enemy that refused to surrender. But the British, like the Americans, treated the Japanese soldiers they captured humanely. Let me share a passage from British Colonel Frederick Spencer Chapman's diaries. Chapman, who served in Malaya, described the initial reactions of captured Japanese soldiers. "When we took them prisoner, most of them were trembling. It wasn't fear, it was more like bewilderment. They had been trained to see us as monsters, but instead they found people offering them tea, sharing their cigarettes, dressing their wounds. Some couldn't believe it. They thought it was a trap, but as days passed, they accepted the truth." Accepting this truth was a long process for many Japanese soldiers because the propaganda had penetrated so deeply. The Imperial Japanese Army had subjected its soldiers to systematic brainwashing. Americans and British had been demonized. Horrific tortures allegedly inflicted by Western forces had been described, and these stories were so vivid, so detailed, that soldiers wholeheartedly believed them to be true. Let's look at some examples of Japanese propaganda. A pamphlet distributed in 1942 stated, "American soldiers put our captured Japanese brothers in cages. They treat them like animals. They watch them starve to death. Then they throw their bodies to the dogs." Another propaganda film showed scenes of American soldiers executing Japanese prisoners by firing squad. Of course, these scenes were completely fabricated, but for the Japanese soldier watching, they were real. And this propaganda shaped Japanese soldiers' behavior on the battlefield. They chose death over surrender. They launched suicide attacks. They fought to their last bullet, because even death seemed better than the horror that capture would bring. But the reality was very different. Let's examine the Japanese POW camps in America. Several prisoner camps had been established on U.S. soil. These camps met all the requirements of the Geneva Convention. Prisoners lived in clean barracks. They were given 3 meals a day. Medical care was provided. Some camps even had sports activities, library services, and educational programs. Japanese prisoners could write letters. They could receive Red Cross packages. They lived a life befitting human dignity. Camp McCoy was a POW camp in Wisconsin. Information compiled from the memories of Japanese prisoners held there was striking. One of the prisoners, Lieutenant Nakamura, said, "When I first arrived, I thought this camp was a transit point. I thought they would hold us here and then execute us. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months. No one touched us. On the contrary, we were well fed. Doctors conducted regular checkups. We even made friends with American guards. For me, this was a miracle." Another prisoner, Sergeant Tanaka, offered a different perspective. "The food we were given was better than the rations we ate at the front. The Americans gave us whatever they gave their own soldiers. Sometimes meat dishes, sometimes vegetable pilaf, sometimes even dessert. While my family in Japan was writhing with hunger, I was filling my stomach in an enemy camp. What irony!" Similar stories came from British camps. Cowra Camp in Australia was one of the camps where the most Japanese were held. The conditions there were initially unbelievable for Japanese prisoners. Clean water, regular meals, medical care, even recreation areas. Japanese soldiers struggled to understand this treatment. Some thought it was a psychological warfare tactic. Some assumed the Allies expected something in return. But as time passed, they accepted that it was real. Now I want to address a very important point. Some might ask, did American and British soldiers never mistreat anyone? Were there no rule violations? Of course, exceptions occurred under war conditions. Individual violations, momentary outbursts of anger, isolated incidents happened. But these weren't the system. They weren't policy. On the contrary, when such behavior was detected, it was punished. American military courts tried those who violated prisoner rights. The British Army strictly enforced discipline rules. So even though there were exceptions, the general policy and practice were clear. Prisoners would be treated humanely. And this policy wasn't just a moral choice. There was strategic thinking behind it as well. American and British intelligence units had discovered something very important. Prisoners who received good treatment were more inclined to cooperate. They shared valuable intelligence information. They provided critical details about the Japanese army, and some even addressed their own people in propaganda broadcasts, explaining the futility of war. So treating people humanely wasn't just the right thing to do, it was also an effective method. Let's examine the interrogations conducted by U.S. naval intelligence with Japanese prisoners. Traditional interrogation methods, pressure, threats, and violence, didn't work on Japanese soldiers. These soldiers were ready to die. Torture didn't frighten them. But a respectful and humane approach yielded completely different results. A cup of coffee, a cigarette, a sincere conversation. These simple gestures broke down the walls of Japanese prisoners, and over time, they began sharing information voluntarily. To understand this transformation of Japanese prisoners, we need to consider the psychological dynamics. These soldiers had lived within a rigid hierarchy for years, absolute loyalty to the emperor, unquestioning obedience to superiors, suppression of individual will. And then, when they were captured, they had the chance to confront themselves for the first time. Without propaganda, without pressure, an opportunity to form their own thoughts. and many began to question everything they had believed. One of the most striking examples of this questioning is the story of Japanese prisoner Kazuo Sakamaki. Sakamaki was an officer who served on a midget submarine during the Pearl Harbor attack. When his submarine malfunctioned, he washed ashore and was captured by Americans. He was the first Japanese prisoner of war, and this situation was devastating for him. In Japanese culture, being captured was a disgrace to the family. Sakamaki tried to commit suicide but failed, and then the treatment awaiting him surprised him. The Americans treated him well. They dressed his wounds. They gave him adequate food. They spoke respectfully. Sakamaki didn't believe any of it at first. He thought it was a game. But as months passed, his thinking changed. In his memoirs, written after the war, he said, "The Americans treated me not like an enemy, but like a human being. This experience changed my entire worldview. I understood how meaningless war was, how destructive propaganda was." Sakamaki's story wasn't unique. Thousands of Japanese prisoners underwent similar transformations, and these transformations played an important role in post-war Japan's democratization. These prisoners had seen the true face of the West. They knew the propaganda was lies, and when they returned to their country, they shared this knowledge. Now let's look more closely at the British side. The Burma campaign was one of World War II's most difficult operations. British and Allied forces fought against the Japanese army for years. Jungle warfare, tropical diseases, logistical nightmares. And yet, British soldiers treated the Japanese they captured humanely. British units that participated in the Chindit operations in particular left interesting testimonies. Japanese soldiers captured in the jungle were often wounded and exhausted. British soldiers carried these prisoners, fed them, treated them, and they did this while their own resources were limited, but they still shared, because this was part of their value system. Let me share a passage from British Captain John Masters' memoirs. "In the Burmese jungle, we captured a Japanese soldier. He had been shot in the leg and had lost a lot of blood. My men didn't want to carry him at first. Even our own wounded were being carried with difficulty. But I ordered it. He was a human being too. Being an enemy didn't strip him of his humanity. And that night we dressed his wound with our own bandages. We gave him water from our own canteens. The next day we got him to the main camp. That Japanese soldier looked at me with tears in his eyes. He didn't know a single word of English, but his eyes said everything." Stories like these were points of light in war's dark picture. And these points of light weren't coincidental. They were the product of systematic values education, of an institutional understanding of justice. Another interesting phenomenon in Japanese POW camps was cultural change. Japanese soldiers came into close contact with American and British culture. They listened to American music, they read British books, they observed a different way of life, and many began to question their own culture. They saw how destructive militarism was. They understood the value of individual freedom. They grasped what democracy meant. This cultural change produced concrete results in the post-war period. Former prisoners who returned to Japan took active roles in rebuilding their country. They supported democratic reforms. They advocated for confronting the militarist past, and they encouraged building friendship with the West. So the humane treatment experienced in American and British camps contributed not only to shaping that moment, but the future as well. But this should also be noted. This transformation wasn't universal. Some Japanese prisoners never changed their views even after the war. They continued to see being captured as a disgrace. They didn't forgive themselves, and they struggled to integrate into society. The stigma in Japanese culture around being captured made these people's lives difficult. But still, for the majority, the camps were an experience of enlightenment. The behavior of American and British soldiers holds a special place in the history of warfare, because even at the moment when they had every right, they didn't take revenge. The Japanese army had inflicted horrific treatment on Allied prisoners. Bataan, the Burma Railway, Changi, each one was a crime against humanity. And American and British soldiers knew this. They had heard what their friends, their comrades in arms, had suffered. Anger, wanting revenge, that would have been the most natural reaction, but they didn't do it. This was the sign of true strength, because true strength isn't just defeating the enemy. True strength is not abandoning your values even in the moment of victory. True strength is responding to hatred, not with hatred, but with humanity. And American and British soldiers displayed this true strength in the hell of the Pacific. If these stories have moved you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Let this video reach more people and let this important history lesson be learned by everyone. In the third and final part, we'll tell the story of the post-war period, the return of Japanese prisoners to their homeland, how this experience shaped their lives, and most importantly, what this story teaches us today. The lessons of how humanity can shine even in war's darkest times await you in Part 3. The legacy of humanity in war's darkest hour. We've arrived at the third and final part. In the first two parts, we went on an incredible journey. We saw the shock Japanese soldiers experienced when they entered American and British POW camps. We described how propaganda collapsed in an instant, how they encountered humane treatment instead of the expected brutality. We examined real testimonies, archival documents, and historians' research. We saw how American and British soldiers never abandoned their values, even under the most difficult conditions. Now, we're opening the final and most important act of this story, the post-war period, the return of Japanese prisoners to their homeland, how this experience shaped their lives and an entire generation, the lasting legacy left by American and British soldiers, and what this story teaches us today. If you're ready, let's begin the final part. August 1945. World history was about to change forever. On the morning of August 6th, an American bomber named Enola Gay was flying over Hiroshima. Seconds later, the first atomic bomb in human history fell on a city. 3 days later, the second bomb struck Nagasaki. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives instantly, and Japan, for the first time in its history, was brought to its knees. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio. Known as the Jewel Voice broadcast, this was the first time most Japanese people had ever heard the emperor's voice. Hirohito announced that the war had been lost, that Japan had surrendered. For millions of Japanese, this was like the end of the world. The empire they thought invincible had collapsed. The emperor they considered divine was raising the white flag as a mortal man. People wept in the streets. Some froze in shock. Some took their own lives. The Japanese spirit had been shattered. And American occupation forces were about to set foot on Japanese soil. What about the Japanese soldiers in POW camps? What did this news mean for these soldiers held in American and British camps thousands of miles away? The answer was complicated, because these soldiers were in a unique position. On one hand, news that the war was over brought relief. They could finally go home. They could see their families. They had survived. On the other hand, there was the shame and pain of defeat. The empire had fallen. The cause they had fought for had lost. And most importantly, how would society receive them as soldiers who had been captured? This last question was the greatest fear gnawing at many Japanese prisoners' minds. Because in Japanese culture, being captured was an unforgivable sin. According to the Bushido Code, a warrior should die rather than be captured. A warrior's honor was more valuable than his life, and losing this honor brought shame not just to the individual, but to the entire family. Do you know what happened to the families of soldiers who were captured in Japan? Some families, upon learning that their relative had been captured, considered him dead. Funeral ceremonies were held, gravestones were erected, names were erased from family records. They acted as if that person had never existed, because having a captured family member was a disgrace in society. Neighbors would gossip, finding work became difficult, marriage proposals would stop coming. So Japanese prisoners, even though they had physically survived, were considered socially dead. And this is exactly where the experience in American and British camps played a critical role, because these camps hadn't just provided physical safety for Japanese prisoners, they had also opened a space for psychological transformation. Let's look at testimonies from former Japanese prisoners who returned from the camps. These were compiled from post-war interviews, written memoirs, and historians' research, and each one shows how deeply this experience left its mark. Former Japanese prisoner Hiroshi Abe said the following in a comprehensive interview years later. "The 2 years I spent in camp were the most enlightening period of my life. At first, I doubted everything. I thought there was a trap behind the Americans treating us well. Maybe they wanted information, maybe they would use us for propaganda. But days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and no trap emerged. We only received consistent, humane treatment. This consistency destroyed all my doubts, and finally I understood that everything we had been taught was a lie. Americans weren't monsters, they were human beings just like us, people with families, dreams, and fears. This awareness became the foundation of my post-war life. When I returned home, I carried this knowledge with me, and this knowledge guided me in building the new Japan." Another former prisoner, Takeshi Yamamoto, offered a different perspective. "When I returned home, people avoided me. I could feel their stares as I walked down the street. I could hear the whispers. I was branded as a soldier who had been captured. Even my family was distant at first. My father didn't speak to me for weeks. I could read the shame on his face. But I had returned with different knowledge inside me. I knew that the enemy wasn't really the enemy. I knew that the propaganda was lies, and this knowledge kept me standing despite society's pressure. There was something I learned in the American camp. Human dignity is universal. Nationality, race, religion don't matter. Every human being deserves respect. I never forgot this lesson, and I dedicated the rest of my life to teaching this lesson to others." A third testimony came from Kenji Nakamura. Nakamura was a former prisoner who became a teacher in the post-war period. "I learned English in camp. I conversed with American guards. I listened to their stories, and I understood that they too were afraid like us, missed their homes like us, wanted the war to end like us. This simple truth changed my entire worldview. After the war, I became a teacher, and I always told my students this: the people we call enemies are also human. Judging them without knowing them is the greatest mistake. This lesson was the most valuable thing I learned in the American camp." These testimonies offer invaluable clues for understanding post-war Japan's transformation, because former prisoners returning to their country became the group that showed the least resistance to American occupation and democratic reforms. They had already seen the true face of the West. They knew the propaganda was lies, and they had accepted that change was inevitable, even necessary. The American Occupation Administration under General Douglas MacArthur launched fundamental reforms in Japan, and these reforms laid the foundations of modern Japan. A new constitution was written. This constitution transformed Japan from a militarist empire into a peaceful democracy. The right to wage war was renounced. Fundamental rights and freedoms were guaranteed. The emperor's authority was reduced to a symbolic level. Women were given the right to vote. Japanese women gained the right to participate in the political process for the first time in history. This was a revolutionary change in Japanese society. Land reform was implemented. Large landowners' estates were distributed to landless peasants. This fundamentally changed the structure of rural Japan. The education system was reorganized. Militaristic ideology was removed from the curriculum. Democratic values and critical thinking began to be taught. Giant corporate conglomerates called zaibatsu were broken up. Economic power was spread across a broader base. And all these reforms were implemented with surprisingly little resistance. Why? Because the Japanese people saw that Americans were not just occupiers, but also fair, and the humane treatment shown to prisoners during the war played a significant role in forming this perception of justice. Former prisoners shared positive testimonies about Americans in their local communities. "I was in their hands. They treated me well," they said. These testimonies reduced hostility toward the occupation forces. Fear and hatred began to be replaced by cautious trust, and this trust laid the groundwork for accepting democratic reforms. Japanese professor Ikohiko Hata is a historian who has conducted extensive research on this subject. According to Hata's work, former prisoners returning from American and British camps served as a bridge in post-war Japanese society. They filled the gap between East and West with their own experiences. They were living proof that turned enmity into friendship, and this bridge played a critical role in Japan's reconstruction. What about the Allied side? What did this experience mean for American and British soldiers? American and British veterans returning from war came home with mixed feelings. On one hand, there was the pride of victory. They had defeated tyranny. They had saved the world from fascism. They had successfully completed history's greatest military operations. On the other hand, there were the traumas of war: lost friends, witnessed atrocities, experienced horrors, the heavy burden of things done and not done. But for many veterans, the humane treatment they showed to prisoners was a memory that eased their conscience and made them proud. Even at the moment when they had every right, they hadn't taken revenge. Even at their angriest, they hadn't lost control. Even when their enemies acted most brutally, they had remained humane. And this was a legacy to be proud of. Let me share a passage from American veteran Robert Johnson's memoirs. Johnson was a soldier who fought as a Marine in the Pacific and had direct contact with Japanese prisoners. Years later, in letters he wrote to his family, he said, "I did many things in war. I'm proud of some. I regret others. Some decisions I made under fire still keep me up at night. But how we treated Japanese prisoners has always been one of the things I remember with pride. Yes, they were our enemies. They had killed our friends. They had done terrible things. Maybe they deserved every kind of revenge, but we treated them like human beings because that's who we were. That's what American values meant. And these values were valid even on the battlefield, in the middle of hell. This matters to me because after the war ended, I needed to be able to look in the mirror, and I did, and I wasn't ashamed of what I saw." British veteran Thomas Williams expressed similar feelings. "In Burma, we went through hell. In the depths of the jungle, we fought against malaria, dysentery, Japanese snipers. The Japanese made us suffer. I lost friends. I saw terrible things. There were 1,000 reasons to hate, but we never stooped to their level. Never. We treated every Japanese soldier we captured as a human being. We dressed their wounded. We fed their hungry. We spoke to them with respect. That's what being British meant. Justice, mercy, honor. These values were inherited from our grandfathers, and we passed this legacy to future generations without staining it. I will be proud until I die for staying true to these values, and I will always tell my sons, my grandsons about this story. These testimonies are proof of how humanity can be preserved even in war's darkest times, and this proof remains valid today. It continues to be a source of inspiration for every generation. Now let's look from a broader perspective. The prisoner policy of American and British armies wasn't just a moral choice, it was also a strategic success, and the results of this success were clearly visible in the post-war order. Japan became one of the United States' most loyal allies in the post-war period. This transformation was one of history's most surprising examples. Think about it. The country that attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941 had become America's most reliable partner in Asia by the 1950s. How did this happen? Of course, many factors played a role: Cold War realities, economic interests, geopolitical calculations. But beneath all of this was a foundation of trust, and this trust was based on foundations laid during the war. Americans had treated Japanese prisoners humanely. When they occupied Japan, they maintained the same attitude. They didn't loot, they didn't oppress civilians, they applied justice, and the Japanese saw this. They understood that Americans were not only powerful, but also fair, and this fairness built trust. Today, U.S.-Japan relations are one of the world's strongest bilateral partnerships. Military alliance, economic cooperation, cultural exchange. The two countries have become indispensable allies to each other. And the roots of this partnership go back 80 years to the humanity shown in the darkness of war. The same was true for Britain. British-Japanese relations gradually normalized in the post-war period. This wasn't an easy process. Memories of the Burma Railway, Changi, the fall of Singapore were fresh. Thousands of British families were mourning relatives lost in Japanese camps. Even forgiving, even talking was difficult. But as time passed, wounds began to heal. Trade agreements were signed, diplomatic ties were established, cultural exchange programs were launched, and today Britain and Japan are partners cooperating in many areas. The behavior during the war played a significant role in making this normalization possible. The British had treated Japanese prisoners humanely. This made building bridges easier in peacetime. It established a foundation for mutual respect, and in the long run, it transformed enmity to partnership. Now I want to make a very important comparison, because to fully grasp the meaning of this story, we need to look at the other side of the coin. Let's remember how the Japanese army treated Allied prisoners, and let's see the consequences of that treatment. The Bataan Death March, Philippines, 1942. After the fall of Corregidor, tens of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers surrendered to Japanese forces, and the nightmare that followed formed one of history's darkest pages. Prisoners were forced to march over 60 miles under the scorching tropical sun. No water was given, no food was given, no rest was allowed. Those who fell were bayoneted or shot. Those who approached streams to drink water were killed. Those who tried to escape were executed. Thousands of people lost their lives during this march. Survivors were sent to the hell of the camps, and there too, death, starvation, and disease awaited them. The Burma Railway, the Thailand-Burma border. The Japanese army wanted to build a strategic railway, and they needed labor for this. British, Australian, Dutch, and other Allied prisoners were forced to work on this project. Tropical diseases ran rampant: malaria, cholera, dysentery. Food was inadequate, living conditions were terrible, and working hours were inhumane. Hundreds of lives were lost for every mile of railway. This project, which earned the name Death Railway, cost the lives of tens of thousands of prisoners. To say the bridges were built on bones was no exaggeration. Changi Prison, Singapore. After Singapore's fall, British and Allied prisoners were gathered here. They experienced this hell until the end of the war. Starvation, disease, torture, arbitrary executions, psychological torment. Survival was a struggle that had to be won anew every day. For many, this struggle was lost. And many more. The Sandakan Death March was even more horrific than Bataan. Hell ships transported prisoners like animals. When Allied bombardments hit these ships, the prisoners inside drowned. Work camps in mines and factories used prisoners like slaves, each one a separate tragedy, each one a crime against humanity. After the war, these atrocities were held to account. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal was established. Japanese generals, politicians, and camp commanders were tried. Many were executed or received prison sentences. Was justice served? That's debatable, but at least these crimes were documented, recognized, and condemned. Now ask yourself, American and British soldiers knew all of this. They had heard what their friends, brothers, and fathers had suffered. They had seen the skeletal men emerging from liberated camps. They had heard horror stories firsthand. Anger, wanting revenge, would have been the most natural reaction. Treating Japanese prisoners the same way, saying an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, could have been seen as easy and even justified. But they didn't do it. Why? Because they knew that stooping to the enemy's level actually means losing to them. Repeating the atrocities the enemy committed legitimizes those atrocities. Taking revenge can give temporary satisfaction, but in the long run it darkens your soul. And true victory is won not only on the battlefield, but also in the moral arena. American and British soldiers won this moral victory. In history's greatest war, under the most difficult conditions, even at the moment when they had every right, they didn't abandon their values, and this left a legacy even more lasting than military victory. What does this story teach us today? This question needs to be taken seriously, because history exists not only to understand the past, but also to live the present and build the future. First, it shows the power and danger of propaganda. Japanese soldiers had been subjected to systematic brainwashing for years, propaganda that demonized the enemy, that stripped them of humanity, and this propaganda fueled a war that led to the deaths of millions. When soldiers stop seeing the enemy as human, committing any atrocity against them becomes easy. Similar propaganda exists today. Rhetoric that demonizes different groups, nations, beliefs, and ideas on social media, in traditional media, in the political arena. And history shows us that this rhetoric always ends in disaster. Second, it shows the power of humane treatment. When Japanese prisoners received humane treatment from their enemies, their entire worldview changed. Years of propaganda collapsed with a few simple gestures: a glass of water, a bandage, a respectful look, a shared cigarette. These small acts created lasting transformations. They dissolved enmity. They built trust. The same applies today. Treating people we see as enemies humanely can end enmity. A gesture of kindness can be more powerful than 1,000 words. Third, it shows the importance of values. American and British armies didn't just write rules on paper, they internalized these rules, made them into values, reinforced them through training, leadership, and exemplary behavior. And they stayed true to these values even in the most difficult moments. Today, too, institutions, societies, and individuals need values. Values that exist not just in words, but in actions. Values that stand firm when tested, under pressure, in difficult times. Being virtuous in easy times is easy. The real test comes in hard times. Fourth, it shows the complexity of history. World War II wasn't a simple good versus evil story. There were heroes and traitors on every side. Courage and cowardice existed side by side. Humanity and brutality coexisted in the same war, sometimes on the same front, sometimes in the same person. And this complexity makes understanding history difficult, but also enriching. Today, too, instead of seeing the world in black and white, we need to accept shades of gray. Instead of easy answers, we need to confront difficult questions. Fifth, it shows the importance of leadership. In American and British armies, treating prisoners humanely was a policy, and this policy was implemented from the top down. Generals ordered it, officers followed, NCOs implemented it, and ordinary soldiers followed this example. Good leadership encourages and rewards good behavior. Bad leadership ignores or encourages bad behavior. Even in wartime, leadership makes a difference. In peacetime, too. Finally, it shows the power of hope. Even in war's darkest times, humanity shone through. There were soldiers who showed mercy to their enemies. There were those who responded to hatred with love. And this light defeated the darkness. Today, too, it's easy to fall into despair. Looking at the world's problems, feelings of helplessness are normal. But history shows us that there is always a light. There is always a better way. As long as we keep searching for that light, as long as we have the courage to walk that path. In this video series, we told a little-known but very important story of World War II, the shock and transformation Japanese prisoners of war experienced in American and British camps, the collapse of propaganda, the triumph of humanity. This story is one of the most inspiring pages of war history, and I hope this story has deeply affected you, too. American and British soldiers fought in the hell of the Pacific and the jungles of Burma. They lost friends, they suffered, they experienced fear, they got angry, but they never lost their humanity. They defeated the enemy with their weapons, but they also won with their character. They went down in history with their values. This was true heroism. Showing courage under fire makes you a hero, but showing mercy in the moment of victory makes you a legend. And these soldiers became legends. The legacy of these heroic soldiers lives on today. The friendship between the U.S. and Japan is based on foundations laid in those days. The partnership between Britain and Japan is the fruit of the humanity shown in those difficult days. And the world needs those soldiers' values more than ever, today, tomorrow, and always. If this story has moved you and you want content like this to continue, subscribe to the channel now, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps these stories reach more people. In our next video, we'll tell another little-known story of World War II. This time, our focus will be the European front, Allied prisoners in German hands and their incredible escape stories. The true story of the Great Escape from Stalag Luft III, the impossible escapes from Colditz Castle, tunnels, disguises, courage, and ingenuity, the most thrilling operations of the pre-Cold War era. These stories will be just as striking as today's, perhaps even more so. So don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and don't miss the next video. Wars end, but stories remain, and these stories remind us who we are, our humanity, our values, our fears and our courage, our hopes and our dreams. This channel will continue telling these stories, because understanding the past is the first step in building the future, and we're taking this step together. Thank you for watching this video. See you in the next video. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye.